Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz, Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, which is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. CESPA tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. This episode will discuss the ongoing savagery in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. Normally, I give my own opening, which also serves as my editorial note of sorts. But I'm going to do something different for this one. I will read out an excerpt, a heartfelt one, from the guest on this episode, who I shall introduce shortly. Last fall, and this is the excerpt. Last fall, as I struggled to articulate a response to the events of October 7th, I recalled some verses from W.H. Auden's poem, September 1, 1939. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Watching the Democratic National Convention this week, and the guest that I'm talking about wrote this just after the Democratic National Convention. So when he watched the Democratic National Convention this week, he says, I've been struggling again. I share the excitement and optimism around the candidacy and campaign of Kamala Harris. And yet, yesterday, as the spirit, words, and music of Black America challenged us to reach our higher ground, a message from the Gaza Poets Society reached me. Please forget about us, forget our names, our freedom to exist, the bloodstains on your screens, the screams under your pillows, the echo of our hunger, our bodies buried in rubble, the blood that pools in our streets, its scent lingering. Forget whether we resemble each other or not, whether we speak the same language or not, whether our children are of similar age or not, whether we sleep or you cannot, whether we dream or you do not. Simply forget us. Whether it is better to perish in the summer of early sorrows or the winter of delayed defeats, whether we are interred in a communal grave or abandoned for stray dogs to consume, simply forget us. For we too have lost the memory of your existence. Trying to hold these two realities in my consciousness, another poem by Auden came to mind, Mazid Bouza, a meditation on Pieter Bruegel's painting Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. Bruegel depicted the moment that Icarus splashed into the sea, his body already submerged, only his last leg still falling out of the air. Yet the viewer can hardly find that tiny image hidden in the lower right corner of a landscape and seascape busy with the lives of others. Icarus drowns in sight of the shore and a galley setting out on a new voyage. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away. Quite leisurely from the disaster, the plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to, and sailed calmly on. But can we sail calmly on, knowing not just that innocents are drowning, but that we have supplied bombs that have left bloodstains on our screens and screams under our pillows? Let me now introduce my guest and say a few words of my own. I have with me Dr. Barnett Rubin. My introduction to Dr. Rubin was through two books in the mid-90s. The Fragmentation of Afghanistan, State Formation and Collapse in the International System, and the Search for Peace in Afghanistan from Buffer State to Failed State. This was a time when I was the news editor of the Friday Times, and we had our offices above Vanguard Books on the mall. One of the perks of the job, given my appetite for books, was that I could squeeze my chief editor, Mr. Najam Sethi, for a 30% discount on books I would pick up from Vanguard. For his part, and since I'm going to send this program to him so he knows that I mentioned this, he not only encouraged me, but would also recommend new books. Later, I picked up Blood on the Doorstep, The Politics of Preventing Violent Conflict, which again by Dr. Rubin and came out in 2002. In addition to the books that I mentioned, Dr. Rubin has written several others about post-Soviet political order, stabilizing Nigeria, conflict prevention in South Balkans, calming the Fergana Valley. The list is long. He was a leading expert on Western Central Asia when the so-called War on Terror began. And from April 2009 through October 2013, he was a senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the US Department of State. And earlier in November-December 2001, he served as special advisor to the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan during the negotiations that produced the Bonn Agreement. He subsequently advised the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan on the drafting of the Constitution, the Afghanistan Compact, and the Afghanistan National Development Strategy. But the one thing I did not know until the beginning of the murderous war in Gaza was Dr. Rubin's background in Jewish history and the passion with which he has since written about the war and its trajectory. Many mainstream publications in the United States have shied from printing him, which got him to start his Substack, Appointed Times. He also began to write his personal history as a Jew, which I believe began with a long piece in Boston Review entitled False Messiahs: How Zionism's Dreams of Liberation Became Entangled with Colonialism. He has appeared before on InFocus, but I thought it best to invite him back to discuss where the situation stands and what possible trajectory the conflict is likely to take. Barney, thank you so much for being on the program. You know, I've been following your writing. And I'm not talking about Afghanistan. I'm talking about this post-Gaza thing. And I was just looking at a tweet that you put out about an hour ago with reference to the fact that the Philadelphia corridor is just a spin. Netanyahu just does not want a ceasefire and a hostage deal. Let's begin with that, but then I want to go back to the United States with reference to the piece that I mentioned after the DNC to talk about how experts like yourselves and also American citizens like yourselves, what kind of quandary do you think you are in with reference to who to vote for? So let's begin with this tweet, which talks about Netanyahu's Philadelphia corridor condition more as a spin than the reality.
Thank you very much, Ejaz, for that very generous introduction. I hardly recognize myself, but you asked me about that tweet. The tweet is based on an article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which quoted an anonymous member of the government of Netanyahu saying that his public position that he will not remove Israeli troops from the so-called Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Gaza and Egypt, is just for show. In fact, he does not want a deal that would lead to a ceasefire and the exchange of hostages. And in addition, many people in his cabinet know that, but they are not courageous enough to oppose him. Now, even more puzzling, and this is what I didn't write the tweet in order to say that Benjamin Netanyahu is a hardliner. I guess everybody knows that. What struck me was, while this is going on, and it's very evident that he does not want an agreement, the United States government is continuing to give Israel massive weapons of mass destruction. And I would have to say, pretending that it's doing so in order to persuade Israel to agree to a ceasefire and hostage deal, whereas nothing will do that as long as Netanyahu is the decision maker. The only way to change the situation, for the United States to change the situation, would be an arms embargo on Israel, which would not immediately change the situation, but it might lead to the fall of the government of Netanyahu. At any rate, but I'm not privy to the inner thoughts or debates of the senior officials of the U.S. government, but it is such an obvious. I mean, what I said in the tweet is it's some combination of hypocrisy and cowardice that leads them to do that, because there is no logic to it. Unless the only logic would be, and I can hear people telling me this, that the U.S. actually secretly supports what Netanyahu is doing.
Yes.
And I think the rationale, excuse me if I give the rationale, because I have found that when I explain the behavior of people, people think that by explaining it, I am justifying it. That is not the case. But you can see how, from his point of view, if he agrees to a ceasefire and lets Hamas continue to exist, then he is rewarding the taking of hostages. So, although he won't say so, he's willing to sacrifice the lives of all the hostages in order to pursue his goal of complete victory over Hamas. And this is what I call, it's like a cult of violence, which is dominant in Israel. I see it in the U.S. security establishment too. Not everyone, and I'm sure you can see it in Pakistan as well, where people, some people believe that violence is always effective, and the only problem is maybe you haven't applied enough of it.
Absolutely. Now, I was talking to Alan Mizrahi on this very program. This is a couple of months ago. And I've also been listening to Gideon Levy and others. They're very clear that this whole approach, even when people are opposed to Netanyahu politically, there is something that has changed in the Israeli society. And the society as a whole, barring exceptions, of course, which is why we have critics, as a whole is prepared to dehumanize and exterminate the Palestinians. And so there is only one problem here, which, i.e., the hostages. If there were no hostages, going by this argument, there would have been no demonstrations in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. Netanyahu would have had a free hand to do what he wills. And that's the kind of sentiment, or that's the kind of analysis which is really diabolical, to say the least. And I want to get your take on this before I go back to another issue with reference to the hostages. But first, I want you to give me your sense of how the Israeli society has dehumanized itself by dehumanizing the Palestinians.
Well, of course, I haven't been in Israel in many, many years, and the impressions I got, my knowledge, such as it is, of the situation in Israel, is dependent on the same people that you mentioned: Alon Mizrahi, Gideon Levy, and many others with whom I'm in contact one way or the other. So I don't know that I have anything to add to what they have said, but I often think about this. I think about it constantly, actually, trying to understand it. And you see, if you start out from the point of view which most Jewish Israelis have, which is, we have not done anything wrong. We tried to compromise with the Palestinians so many times, and they wouldn't do it because they just won't accept us. They hate us. So there's nothing else we can do. So they ask me when I talk to them, what would you want us? What do you think we should do? So it comes down to just a basic. They believe in their version of history, and their construction of the world, they belong there more than the Palestinians do.
Yeah.
It's their land, and they're they'll let them stay there if they behave. But um, some of them, of course, are willing to go further. They would, they'll accept the two-state solution. But um, the fact that the Palestinians are still fighting them when they haven't done anything wrong leads them to believe, especially in the light of the painful history of the Jewish people for several thousand years, that they're simply doing it out of hate that cannot be appeased. Now, of course, it's not surprising, it's not unique that after over 100 years of escalating violence, people develop enemy images of each other and dehumanize each other. And to be fair, there's dehumanization of Israelis too, on the part of some Palestinians and some others, and even some pro-Palestinian demonstrators in the United States. But it's hard to understand, but this type of extreme hatred and dehumanization, I'm afraid, results from a violent conflict when you think your survival requires you to kill a lot of people, and the only way that you can tolerate it is by not thinking of them as human beings. So then the next question that I ask myself is, so what is the way out? And of course, the fact that there is a problem does not mean that there is necessarily a solution.
Correct.
I mean, the French Jewish leftist historian of Islam, Maxime Rodinson, wrote in 1967, it may be that violence is the only possible exit from the Israeli Arab, from the situation created by Zionism. But I leave it to others to rejoice in that fact.
Right.
But that's why I think just one point. Some kind of shock from outside has to do it. Has to start the process.
Well, on this point, it's been months that I wrote something for Dawn magazine, and that I was saying that this has now become Mortal Kombat. And the whole idea of a two-state solution, it was never there, frankly, and it lives more in these sort of official shibboleths, nothing concrete about that, because you simply cannot have a state without sovereignty. And then you cannot have two sovereignties living so close to each other with whatever history that they have, which is mostly violent. But coming to the idea of the hostages. So hostages, and this is again a point that I've written about, and frankly, I said that Netanyahu wasn't particularly interested in the hostages. He keeps talking about two main objectives: bringing hostages back and complete destruction of Hamas. But the complete destruction of Hamas overrides the other objective. But he keeps mouthing it because it is politically expedient and, in fact, necessary. But when Gadi Eisenkot, who left the coalition, the war cabinet, but was once the IDF chief of staff, came up with this Hannibal directive. And this was after Hezbollah had kidnapped some IDF soldiers. And Hannibal directive was all about, you have to ensure that no one gets kidnapped. You kill them, including the hostages. And what we have seen is, frankly, something along those lines. What do you think?
Well, I would like to make a slightly different comment. It's not directly about the hostages. First of all, we should broaden our vision of what we're talking about, because the conflict in the West Bank is escalating very
Yes.
dangerously. And it is clear to me that Netanyahu's goal is not limited to destroying Hamas.
Correct.
Uh, in fact, and I hear this, I hear from other Israelis and some Jews in the United States uh, who now don't have the political and diplomatic constraints of President Netanyahu. They have concluded that no matter what they do, the Palestinians will always hate them and try to expel them from the land. Won't live with them in two states, in one state, whatever. And therefore, the only solution is ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Now, that
Yes.
doesn't mean 100%, but Ben Gurion said in 1948 that 60% majority of Jews is not enough for a Jewish state. And in fact, in the course of the year 1948, they increased that to an 80% majority. So now they're back in there. In fact, there is a one state now. There's one state. There's one apartheid state between the river and the sea, and then up to the mountains in the Golan. And in that state, there is about equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians. It's hard to say exactly because there's a larger number of people who are neither Jews nor Palestinians. In particular, people who came to Israel from the former Soviet Union. There's a joke. I'll just tell that this guy was saying in the Soviet Union was saying, "I have a problem. Everyone in my family wants to go to Israel, but I don't want to go." So his friend says, "Well, why don't you let them go, and you can stay here?" And the guy says, "Well, the problem is I'm the only Jew in the family." So a lot of people in the Soviet Union took advantage. Anyway, that's a side issue. So they don't. So it looks like they've made Gaza uninhabitable. When people, I don't know how they expect to reconstruct it. A very good friend of mine, Sultan Barakat, in Qatar, a Palestinian, actually has written an article about how to reconstruct Gaza in such a way that it empowers the people rather than imprisons them. It's very difficult to see how that can happen. And it's clear in the West Bank. Look, Netanyahu has given control of the West Bank to the two most radical nationalists in his cabinet, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are responsible. One's responsible for the police, the other is responsible for security in the West Bank. And they clearly say that they want to build a synagogue on Haram Sharif. They don't say that they want to destroy Masjid al-Aqsa, but that's what they mean, And of course, Netanyahu says we're not going to do that, but he's not stopping them either. So I think this is what I'm just at a loss. This is such a dangerous situation, not just to the Israelis and the Palestinians. I don't understand the complacency with which the U.S. is watching this happen.
But Bani, so one observation made by a number of analysts is, and you mentioned it earlier in the program, is that the United States now. So there's one issue, obviously, which is presenting a certain kind of face to the rest of the world. So the U.S. or the policymakers cannot really up and say, "Oh, listen, Israel wants to exterminate the Palestinians and destroy Hamas, and we are fully with him, and we are going to supply him with everything, and we have greenlit the entire thing." They can't do that. That's bad politics. That bad optics. So there's this whole thing about, well, we are trying our damnedest to somehow get a deal, some kind of ceasefire and the rest of it. And they know that it's bunkum, frankly, because the July deal, which Hamas has actually accepted, and then Netanyahu basically reopened the text and added further conditions to it. And the Americans know this. I mean, Blinken knows this. President Biden knows this. Charlie's aunt knows this. So the idea seems to be that the US is actually encouraging what's happening in an indirect way. Because, as you said earlier, if the United States just simply says no more arms for Israel, Israel cannot sustain this war. They do not have the kind of production capacity, and they do not have the kind of human resource and the rest of it to allow them to sustain the war. And sustainment is the essential condition of continuing a conflict, which is what the Russo-Ukraine war is all about, especially when it becomes iterative. And this is a point that Professors Mearsheimer and Wald talked about when they talked about the Israel lobby, and they were resoundingly condemned by a number of people. I want to get your take on this. I mean, what is your, not just your feeling, but your observation as an analyst of why the US is continuing to support this murderous conflict?
Well, I think it's a political issue as follows. Donald Trump and his followers in the Republican Party, and those ex-Republicans who are against Trump, and right-wing Zionists, some of whom might have something to do with the Democratic Party, they are on board with this policy. Okay, they think that completely destroying the society in Gaza, starving the people, endangering them with epidemics and so on, they classify that all as Israel's right to self-defense. Okay, of course, it's not self-defense. Now, I believe, Biden was asked the other day by a journalist, do you think that Bibi Netanyahu is doing everything he can to get a deal? And his answer was no. But that's all he said. Okay. And as far as I can understand, I've been in the government, or rather not very senior position, but I heard these discussions. They believe, let's say Biden and Harris, they believe that everything depends on their winning. That if they don't win, they won't be able to do anything. And that if, as you know, they're already having political difficulties with the so-called uncommitted movement, which is the movement mostly of Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, who refused to vote for Biden in the primaries and are still. They wanted to have a representative speak at the Democratic National Convention, and they did not get that. So many of them are still saying that they won't vote, and that is putting the Democrats in danger, particularly in Michigan, where there's a large Arab population. But if the administration does what the uncommitted voters and what I would like, impose an arms embargo on Israel, there would be a huge outcry from the Republicans and others, and from parts of the Democratic coalition, because there is a group called, what is it called? I think it's called the Democratic Majority for Israel, which, oddly enough, it's headed by someone who was my graduate student at Yale 30 years ago, and which is a very pro-Israel, pro-Zionist group within the Democratic Party. And it's very difficult for the Democrats to lose the Arab vote, especially in Michigan. It would be disastrous if they lost, not the whole, but a portion, say 20%. The Jews vote about 80% for the Democrats, which I think people around the world don't understand that. But suppose it went down to 60%. That would be very damaging for them. And they're not willing to take such a political risk. And there's another issue, which is, I talked about the Israelis being completely convinced that they're right and they haven't done anything wrong to Palestinians. Biden is, and many others, American political elite, grew up with, as I did, by the way, the idea that Israel was the heroic response to the Holocaust. And, as Biden said, no Jew can be safe without the state of Israel, which you wonder what he's doing about people like me in the United States. He's supposed to be protecting us. But that is such a powerful belief, combined with the fact that they have no understanding really or empathy for the Palestinians and in general, for colonized people who have a different kind of a history, that they find it impossible. I think Biden in particular would find it impossible to do something that would constitute breaking with Israel. We just can't do that.
When this entire conflict began, I forget the name of the writer. He's a Jewish American writer. He did a long piece on Biden and Biden's entire background and Biden's approach to Israel, and Biden's entire sort of philosophy that there must not be daylight between the United States and Israel. And you might recall that when Netanyahu just visited the United States and spoke to the Congress, when he was meeting with President Biden in the White House, he actually said that here's a Christian Zionist and here's a Jewish Zionist. I mean, he was very clear about that. But I want to ask you, go back to what you said about the political compulsions of the Democrats. Are you implying that, in theory, if Kamala Harris were to win, that her administration's policy with reference to the Palestinians and Netanyahu would undergo a change in favor of the Palestinians?
Well, obviously, I don't know. My best guess would be it will undergo a change in the direction of favoring the Palestinians, but in a completely inadequate and ineffective manner for similar reasons. I mean, what she said in her speech about this issue at the convention, she said, I will always support Israel's right to self-defense.
Yeah, everyone starts with that, Barney. Yeah. I mean, everyone.
Yeah. Then she said, the suffering, the humanitarian problem in Gaza is unbearable, without saying what caused it.
Precisely.
And then he said the Palestinians have a right to safety, security, and she said, and self-determination. Now, I don't know if any American political leader has said before that Palestinians have a right to self-determination. Of course, self-determination has many meanings. But in other words, what she did was she made vague statements to try to satisfy all her constituencies. But there is just so much. You see, it's not. Sometimes I think it's not simply a political issue, about foreign policy. Alas, it really is a social and a cultural issue, because for the majority of people in the United States, I believe this is true, the only thing they know about Palestine, the only things they know about Palestine are what they read in the Bible. And they read the Bible, they hear the Bible read to them in church or in synagogue, and the Bible stopped far short of the age of imperialism and colonialism. I mean, that existed then, the Babylonians, the Romans, etc. But That's you know, I don't know if you saw this, but when the president of Columbia University, I forget her name, but she's a Muslim from Egypt. She's resigned since then. Uh, was testifying before the Senate. A senator from the South said, "Well, the Bible says God gave the land of Israel to the Jews. I hope you believe that." And she got, didn't say much, she got, but in other words, there's a non-negligible number of people who believe that history in the United States, his vision of Palestine, stopped, I don't know, in the year 70 CE. They have no idea what's happened since then. They don't want to know what's happened to them.
I get your point, Barney, but here's the thing. We have seen, and I think that's one of the positives that have come out of this savage conflict. We've seen a number of Jewish scholars. We've seen a number of rabbis that have come out openly and publicly, condemned Israeli policies, talked about the rights of the Palestinians, have even talked about the moral code within Judaism. And I think that has to somehow resonate with the people. I mentioned this because you mentioned Bible and this whole sort of Bible Belt thing, and people just thinking that yes, the Lord gave the land of Canaan, the Holy Land, to the Israelites. But the fact is that there are a number of Jewish people who are saying, well, you got to differentiate between the Judaism and Zionism.
Well, of course, I'm saying that too, and
Of
you're
course,
quite
I know that, which is why I mentioned this.
yeah, and you're quite right that there is a growing number, and there's a very distinct generational difference as well, because the people who grew up, as it were, in the shadow of the Holocaust and uh, during the 6 Day War and so on, they have a strong attachment to Israel in a way that the younger generation doesn't have. So I can't give you statistics, but clearly, in all these demonstrations on university campuses, Jewish students are extremely active, probably proportionately more represented than others. But I want to emphasize this. There are two different Zionist constituencies in the United States. There's AIPAC, Jewish Zionism, and then there is Christian Zionism. And Christian Zionism is much larger than Jewish Zionism.
And it predates Jewish Zionism.
Yes. In fact, without Christian Zionism, there wouldn't be a state of Israel, because the Lord Balfour would not have issued his declaration. But
sorry, Barney, I'm interjecting. But does anyone realize that Christian Zionism, which emanates from Christian eschatology, is actually anti-Semitic?
Yes, some people do. I mean, actually, Al Franken wrote the former senator who is also a comedian. Mainly, he's a comedian. Wrote a book about this, and he described the alliance of the Jewish neoconservatives with the Christian fundamentalists. Says, they agree on strong defense of Israel and so on, but then the Christians believe that this will lead to the return of Jesus, and everyone who doesn't believe in Jesus will then be drowned in a sea of blood. He said, at this point, the political alliance breaks up. So,
but Barney, since we are going to close the program also shortly, I want and I know it's a difficult thing. I hate doing it myself, but I will put it in front of you nonetheless. What's the prognosis? I mean, if the United States is going to keep supporting Israel, and we're not just talking about the United States, but also the US Western allies, if Netanyahu is not brought down politically within Israel, and the conflict goes on, and as you mentioned very rightly, that the occupied Palestinian territories are also now simmering. The Israeli raids going on. It's going to become explosive. What's the prognosis? Is
Well,
it going to be?
let me widen the aperture here too, because of course it's become a regional war as well. You know, with not just Hamas but Hezbollah, um, the Houthis, and of course Iran supporting them. I wouldn't say behind them because Iran doesn't control these groups; it didn't invent them, but Iran supporting them. Um, there is a political opportunity now with the change of the president in Iran.
Yeah.
Uh, um, he's coming to New York for the UN General Assembly, and
And he has been talking about reconciliation and economic uplift and the rest of it.
yes, and he's put back all the old team. Javad Zarif is coming with him if the U.S. gives him a visa, and many other people whom I know personally. So I think it will be possible to open up some dialogue, and even with the present government, you know, the U.S. and Iran have come to some secret, confidential understandings that have limited the escalation of the war regionally. But that might help to control the situation, especially if, it seems inevitable at some point, the Netanyahu government falls and is replaced with a government, will be just slightly less extreme at any rate. Um, I think you have to work on several fronts. The direct conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians is very, very difficult to approach by itself. But if you work on it from the regional aspect, from political aspect, maybe you can make some progress. But still, you come back to the problem you mentioned earlier, which is the two-state solution appears to be an illusion, just a slogan that is used to cover up lack of any process. But I'm afraid the one-state solution also appears to be a solution, because how can these groups live together? So I don't know what the solution is, if there is a solution. But uh, at least I think that the change of government in Iran and a change of government in Israel might open the way to some serious de-escalation.
Yes, I agree with you. There might be a de-escalation, but the problem stays because, if you go back to the Abraham Accords or the sequel to Abraham Accords, the idea was to present the Palestinians and have some kind of deal between Israel and the Arabs. And my own sense is that, among other factors, this was one of the reasons that Hamas did on October 7th.
Absolutely. October 7th was a response to the Abraham Accords.
Right. So that particular problem stays, even if regionally there is de escalation. And it does not, and I agree with you. I mean, I don't have any answer, frankly, which is why I was putting the entire burden of this problem on your shoulders. I don't see any solution. I mean, even if the regional de escalation results in low intensity violence in Gaza and the OPTs, the violence will remain because I cannot figure out a solution to this issue.
Well, I'm not going to predict anything. I don't even know who's going to win the U.S. presidential election.
No
Uh,
one does.
let's say,
Not even the candidates themselves.
yes. I mean, if Trump wins, then we can forget about it. If Harris wins, maybe there's a 10% possibility that the situation will improve. But so, in a way, I mean, I think we have to have some vision of what a solution might be. But we can't try to impose it or make the solution into the immediate goal.
Well, I guess on this not very optimistic note, we shall close this program. I want to remind the viewers, we will give a link once this program goes up. We'll give a link to Dr. Rubin's Substack. And he's doing a personal history, which I believe he wants to ultimately convert into a book. It's absolutely fascinating. So I very strongly recommend that you follow the link and you read what he has been writing. Now, we started with this episode with Dr. Rubin's reference to Auden's two poems. And I want to end it with a reference to Yeats's Easter 1916, just an excerpt. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice, that is heaven's part, our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is said and done. We know the dream enough to know the dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonough and McBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That makes me happy. It doesn't bring me any lucre, but it also helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.